How's it going, adult and aging social workers? Thanks for checking out this video. My name is Jana Blunt. I am the president of the SEIU 10-to-1 Sonoma County Chapter Board. Your Reclass leadership team thought up the great idea to put this video together to make sure that you're up to speed with everything that's happened so far. And we wanted to make sure that we got your feedback and you had the opportunity to let us know what your concerns were and whether or not you had any questions. So this video should be relatively short. It's going to be 3 parts. First, I'll do a quick crash course for what a reclass is. Then we're going to go into your specific reclass to see what's going on. And then lastly, we'll request your feedback. Let's get started. Every job that exists at the county is sorted into a common group based on similarities in duties, responsibilities, and requirements for that particular job. Each job title is called a job classification. For example, a Park Ranger 2 is a job classification, or a Legal Processor 2 is a job classification, especially to what they call benchmark classifications. The benchmark classification is something that human resources uses to compare compensation. They're chosen because these can be found in almost all of the different agencies that we compare our salaries to. SEIU happens to have 41 of these special benchmarks. Most of the other classifications we have are tied to those benchmarks. It's a fun, intricate little web that allows wages to remain consistent. An example here on this little chart, the benchmark we're looking at is Animal Control Officer 2. You have 6 other job classifications that are linked on some level, some of them directly, some what HR considers to be second or third level because they're slightly less similar. And each of these different positions are not benchmarks, but they're tied to this benchmark here. And that benchmark determines the wages for all of these other similar jobs. An Animal Control Officer 1 should make 20% less than the Animal Control Officer 2. Wildlife specialists, on the other hand, should be tied, so they should make about the same. And then supervising animal control officer should make 20% more, for example. A classification study, or what most of us refer to as a reclass, is just when human resources takes a look at the nature and the level of work performed by employees in a specific job classification. And reclasses typically happen, as you know from experience, when there is a gradual change in the duties performed, or relationships and responsibilities of the organization change, when there are recruitment and retention problems, or if there are any mandated changes that occur. One other thing you've learned from experience is what goes on during these studies. So first off, an initial submission is completed by incumbents, yourselves, the folks who are going to be affected by this reclass. Then they're reviewed by supervisors. HR conducts interviews or desk audits with the folks involved. That information is communicated to supervisors and managers to make sure it's all good to go. Then HR goes back and researches comparable agencies outside of the county, as well as comparable positions within the county, depending on the benchmark situation. HR then creates or updates an existing classification specification, or class spec, for that job classification. HR then takes that information and presents it to all of the interested parties through a report. That report and those recommendations are discussed with everyone involved. HR takes any changes to that final report and presents it to the Civil Service Commission or sometimes the Board of Supervisors, depending, for final approval. Right now, where we're at the time of this video, is the second to last star, report/recommendations, discussed and amended with interested parties. There are different factors that determine the recommendations that HR come up with, what kind of decision-making responsibilities you have, the scope and complexity of your work, the nature or the purpose of your contact with others, the KSAs, or knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required of you, supervision that you receive and supervision that you provide, working conditions and physical effort as well. Then lastly, the level and size of the organization. There are different possible outcomes of a class study. There are 4 specifically. The first recommendation that HR could come up with is that a position needs to be reallocated to an entirely different class, one that already exists. Or they need to take that existing class and change it, or there might not be an existing class or different class that's close enough. So much change has occurred that a new class needs to be created out of thin air. Lastly, they might determine that everything is good to go, nothing needs to be changed, the classification's appropriate, and nothing happens. We're going to focus on those three in bold where an actual recommendation for change occurs. That first kind is called a position review, and that's when they reclassify an individual or group from one class to another existing class. The second option is what they call a classification spec update. That's when an existing job specification is updated. Third option, new classification request, when a brand new classification is created. This is the type of reclass that you are dealing with, and that's really good news. The reason being that the first and second options here, in those two scenarios, HR does not examine salary. Their philosophy states that they don't need to, because the first option, when they're just reclassifying a group from one class to another existing class, for example, a group of folks at the sheriff's office who are doing legal processor work, their job has changed over the years to where they're actually supposed to be office assistants instead. It's just going from one to another that already exists, and it's unlikely that their salary is going to change, if at all. The second option, that class spec update, even less likely that salary is going to be looked at, because the existing job spec just needs to be updated. Maybe the responsibilities are out of date, but nothing changes about their job title. Thankfully, when you create a brand new classification, HR has no choice but to examine salary, internally and externally, to make sure that this new job spec is paying the incumbents the appropriate wage. And thankfully, that's the type of reclass that you're undergoing right now. So let's go into the specifics. The inspiration behind this reclass, from what your reclass team has told us, is that the Family, Youth, and Children social workers underwent their own reclass in 2018 to 2019. That resulted in a new classification called CPS social worker, Child Protective Services social worker. They also got a wage increase. The social workers at APS requested a reclass for the adult and aging social workers. The primary priorities and concerns that were raised was that they'd like to have wage parity with CPS social workers. The specs are outdated, 30 to 40 years old, depending on the job classification affected, and the responsibilities are downplayed. Lastly, the specs just don't reflect the required knowledge, skills, and abilities for the work, for the complexity of the work. Other needs that were raised by the people on the reclass team was that law enforcement collaboration needed to improve, and they also wanted HR to look into what can be done about identity protection in dangerous scenarios. The only unfortunate thing about these two priorities is that they can't be achieved through a reclassification. It doesn't mean that they're not important, but just because HR comes back to us with a new job classification write-up, you can't just take that to law enforcement or the DMV and say, hey, you're required to do this. So what that means is that we need to take those two priorities and achieve them through a different route, potentially through a labor management committee, aka an LMC. If you're interested in either of those priorities, or you have other priorities that you'd like to go over in a labor management committee at your division, let us know, because we'd like to make sure that the folks involved Unfortunately, these can't be achieved through a reclassification. but they're important. They just need to be achieved through a different avenue. So we're probably going to get a labor management committee off the ground, aka an LMC, and that's a group that meets with management on a regular basis for your division, voicing concerns and priorities. And these are two of those things that can be brought to the table in a committee like that. If you're interested in being part of the LMC, or if there are different issues you'd like raised at the LMC, please let us know. So let's talk about the initial response from Human Resources. The request for a position review was specifically for the Social Service Worker 4s and the Social Service Supervisor 2s at Adult and Aging. HR's findings was that based on all of the things we talked about, who's served, the duties, the authority, the knowledge required, Human Resources determined that those two positions, after review, were not appropriately classified, and they needed a reclass. HR recommends two new classifications: Adult and Aging Social Worker and Adult and Aging Social Work Supervisor. What they'd like is to reclass the Social Service Worker 4 positions in the A&A division to Adult and Aging Social Worker, and in the Social Services Supervisor 2 positions to be reclassed to Adult and Aging Social Work Supervisors. They also recommend increasing probation of these two positions to 1 year for new employees. This is to catch up with the rest of the county in different positions that are similar to yours. Probation is typically 1 year. That's what they consider to be best practices. It allows the new recruit more time to prove themselves, and it allows the existing team around that new recruit more time to determine how well that new person fits in. It's mutually beneficial. APS was a little surprised by HR's recommendations. They did have other expectations among themselves. What they wanted were 4 classifications: 2 for the social workers at APS and 2 for the folks who are not in APS. The county prefers an umbrella or broad. The county prefers an umbrella method. Broad scope as often as possible. In fact, the county's civil service rules also state that the emphasis of the class plan needs to be as broad as possible to prevent our positions from getting too specific and too difficult to compare to outside positions. In fact, the FY&C social workers and Human Resources mutually regret creating a special CPS social worker classification, and I'll go into why in just a moment. There hypothetically are benefits and drawbacks to creating 4 new classifications instead of 2, if we were to separate APS from the rest of A&A. Now this is a hypothetical, but let's talk about that. HR has made it clear they're not recommending this action, but let's just say we separated APS and non-APS. There are some benefits to it. First, one of the groups is probably going to get a higher wage than the other group. It's unfortunate for that other group, but one of the groups might have a higher wage, and for that group, there would be an enhanced ability to recruit good talent, and that is a desperate, dire need all across the county, as we all know. There are also some drawbacks. If we were to separate it out, salary adjustment would not be guaranteed for all incumbents. It would also remove your ability to transfer between different programs. If you wanted to move to APS, APS requires different duties, qualifications, and knowledge, skills, and abilities than non-APS. Moving to a different unit would require you to apply, compete with outside applicants, promote or demote. This would also delay the reclass process for all incumbents, for all of you. Essentially, human resources would need to restart this whole process. The current recommendations that HR has provided, we have some anticipated results based on our experience. The first one is very obvious. The job specs, the class specifications are just going to be more accurate than they've been. It's also going to result in an increase in his salary. It's also going to result in an increase in salary for all of you. One piece of good news in addition to this is that the external job classifications that HR is comparing you to all happen to be adult protective service based, which is potentially good news for everyone involved salary-wise. So now that we've given you all of that information, we really would appreciate your feedback. We would appreciate your feedback. We want to know your priorities, your worries, your objections, your questions. Submit those to us. It'll go directly to me and your union rep, Michael Valoria, but most importantly, your reclass committee. It's time sensitive. Feedback is due by this Friday, the 23rd. To submit your feedback, please click on our Google Forms link. That is in the video description and also in the email that you got this video link in. Your name and contact information are entirely voluntary. You don't need to enter them at all unless you're requesting a one-on-one response. Regardless, the information's fully confidential and it's only ever going to be viewed by yours truly. What I'm going to do with any questions that you send, those will be answered and I'll distribute those in a single email for everyone in question and answer format. But again, no identifying information will be revealed. We also need your feedback on what HR has presented the division. So you should have seen the packet already. It's also attached to the email that had this link, and it's also linked in the video description to my Google Drive where you can find it there. If you can start on page 8 of that packet and provide any input specifically for the typical duties, the knowledge, skills, and abilities, and the minimum qualifications sections, that would be fabulous. We're going to be meeting again with HR soon. We're trying to hash this information out. So the sooner you get that information to us, the better. Again, your feedback is going to be due by this Friday. So this is your opportunity now to let us know what your priorities and your concerns are. Thanks again for viewing this video, and please reach out to me at the contact information provided in the email if you have any questions at all.